This is a higher level only topic. It's called Terms of Trade, and you'll see a lot of similarities to what we, or a lot of information from what we've already looked at when we looked at comparative advantage. Terms of trade measures the rate of exchange of one good or service for another when two countries trade with each other. So if we're exporting beer and we import wine, if 2 units of beer exchange for 1 unit of wine, we say that we have an exchange rate ratio, or a rate, of 2 to 1, then the price of beer will be half that of wine. In other words, we can buy 1 unit of wine for every 2 of beer that we export. The terms of trade is therefore 1 to 2. And we measure it from the formula. Now, this is a simplistic formula. The actual formula will be a little more complex, but essentially you're looking at the price of exports over the price of imports. So in this case, the price of beer over the price of wine. So the terms of trade is the rate at which one country's goods exchange against another. Now, I do apologize for these old computers. I'll have to update this to something a little more modern. But anyway, let's say we're looking at a production possibility frontier, where country A can produce 1 tractor for every 6 computers. So in other words, we know that the opportunity cost of 1 tractor is 6 computers, because that's what we would be giving up. Country A would be willing to trade. What would country A be willing to trade? If they traded 1 tractor, they would expect to receive at least 6 computers. Why? Because if they didn't receive 6 computers, they might as well produce it themselves, because they can produce it for less. For international trade to be mutually beneficial, we know this from comparative advantage, the terms of trade must lie between the opportunity cost ratios for both countries. If they don't, then the country will not be better off by specialization and trade. And if it does lie between the opportunity cost ratio, then they will be better off by specialization and trade. And just a reminder, when we were looking at this scenario in depth with comparative advantage, we saw with specialization and trade that both countries would be able to consume, not produce, but consume beyond their individual PPF. We calculate the terms of trade as an index number. So I want to emphasize that we're dealing with an index. When we deal with an index, we multiply by 100. Now I just want to rearrange this formula. Terms of trade equals average export price index, and you'll be given it, so you won't have to calculate it, or at least I've never seen a case where you have to calculate it. So we have the average export index over the average import index, and we multiply by 100, because every time that we deal with an index, you are always multiplying by 100. So whether it's an inflation index, the GDP deflator, and so on, index means to multiply by 100. So in a really simplistic way, when we're thinking of terms of trade, if you're running through some exercises, as not an accurate formula, but basically you are looking at export prices over import prices and how these may change. If the base year is 2012, now for every base year, again for every index, the index is always 100. So in this case, the terms of trade index would be 100. So what can you conclude about the terms of trade if you're told that in the next year, the terms of trade index is 105? So what you know is that you know that average export prices have increased faster than import prices. And the following year, we have the terms of trade deteriorated, and it's now 97. So now you've got import prices have increased faster than export prices. If export prices are rising faster than import prices, we say the terms of trade index will rise. In other words, the terms of trade have improved. So you want to watch your vocabulary. This means now that fewer exports have to be given up in exchange for the same given volume of imports. Or in other words, if you had the same volume of exports, they will now buy more imports, hence potentially improving the standard of living. And why potentially improving the standard of living has been underlined is that we also know that if export prices go up, according to the law of demand, if price goes up, quantity demanded will decrease, and we'll have to see to what extent. If import prices rise faster than export prices, we say that the terms of trade have deteriorated. Again, watch the vocabulary. Now we have to have a greater volume of exports to be sold to finance a given amount of imported goods and services. If the terms of trade have improved, then this means that export prices have increased more than import prices, as you know, but this might indicate a deterioration in competitiveness. Why? Well, if you are less efficient or your costs of production have gone up, then the cost of your goods will increase and your export prices will increase and your terms of trade have improved. This is not a good thing. You are less efficient, less competitive. A deterioration in the terms of trade might indicate an improvement in competitiveness. Why? Because perhaps now you are more efficient, your costs of production have decreased, and you're more competitive. So don't associate the terms of trade with vocabulary of improvement and a deterioration as being a good and a bad thing. You have to look at the reason. So as I'm saying, the terminology is somewhat ambiguous. We have to look at the cause to see what's happening in terms of the balance of payments or the current account. And it's the causes of the change of the terms of trade that's really important. So if we had global demand for exports has increased, so this could be because the rest of the world has higher incomes or change in taste and so on, there are a few things we know definitively if demand has increased. So just as a quick reminder, we'll do a little graph. And let's say we look at quantity of exports. We'll look at price. Look at demand 1 and S. And if we look at export revenue before, increase in demand. And now we compare and contrast that with an increase in demand, D2, and this is total revenue after increase in demand. We can see that the total revenue box has indeed increased from the smaller box to the larger box. We know that the price of exports has increased. We know that the terms of trade have therefore improved. We know that export revenue has increased. And so we know that the current account has improved. Now I just want to zero in on this notion of the current account improving for a minute. Sometimes students think if a current account improves, it means that they are now exporting more than importing. That is not necessarily the case at all. A current account improvement means that any current account deficit is now smaller, or any current account surplus is now larger. But it does not mean that exports are now exceeding imports. So please watch you don't make that mistake. So now if we have global demand for the country's exports decreases, what would happen to the price of exports? Well, we know that that would go down. We know that the terms of trade deteriorates. We know that export revenue decreases. And we know that the current account worsens. And if you need to go through the same exercise of showing a demand and supply graph and showing demand for exports decreasing and the total revenue box will in turn also decrease, go ahead and sketch that out. So let's look at just the impacts of the terms of trade of the following situations. So if we have drought lowering the global supply of wheat and country is an exporter of wheat, well, if supply has decreased, we know the price of wheat has gone down, up if supply has decreased, and so terms of trade have improved. OPEC restricts the supply of oil, and country X is an oil importer. So we know that the price of oil would go up. And if they're an importer, not an exporter, so you have to look at the terms of trade from the perspective of what the country is doing, we know that the terms of trade deteriorates because import prices have gone up. If we have an increase in labor productivity in country X, which affects country X's export industries, well, increased labor productivity, increased efficiency will shift the supply curve to the right. Prices will drop, and so terms of trade, so export prices goes down, terms of trade deteriorates. So again, this can be a good thing. You become more efficient, you become more productive. So don't think that the terms of trade deteriorating is necessarily a bad thing. And lastly, for these questions, expansionary fiscal policy leads to an increase in aggregate demand that causes an increase in the rate of inflation. So if you are exporting, your cost of goods have gone up. The price of your goods have gone up and the cost of your goods have gone up. And so terms of trade improve. And again, 3 more testers. The EU and the United States decide to eliminate all export subsidies. Well, if subsidies are removed, then the price of those goods will go up. So they're removing the export subsidies on agricultural products, including products that country E produces for export. So if the price of exports goes up, we know, the terms of trade improve. If there's a decrease in demand for country X's exports, we know the demand curve shifts to the left and the price goes down. So terms of trade deteriorates. And there's an increase in incomes of a country X's main trading partner. So they have become wealthier, who you're selling to, influencing the demand for country X's exports of food, and food is income inelastic. Well, we know if incomes go up elsewhere, the demand for your goods will go up, so the price of your goods will go up, so the terms of trade improve. The fact that demand is income inelastic is a bit of a red herring. It might mean that terms of trade don't, improve a tremendous amount because demand hasn't increased a huge amount, but nonetheless demand has increased, pushing up price of your exports. So factors that can affect the terms of trade, we've looked at some of these: changes in global demand, changes in economic growth, meaning people will want to buy more of your exports. Exchange rates particularly influence import prices. If your currency appreciates or depreciates, imports will become more or less expensive. But if exchange rates change, your price of your exports don't necessarily change. Changes in productivity we've looked at, changes in domestic supply we looked at, inflation we looked at, and we looked at reducing export subsidies. If change in global demand is not responsible for the change in export prices, then the impact of a change in the terms of trade on the trade balance or the current account is going to depend largely on the price elasticity of demand for exports and imports, and we'll see these in some examples. So an improvement in the terms of trade, so export prices rise relatively more than import prices, will worsen the balance of payments if the demand for exports and imports is price elastic or inelastic. It's a lot to take in. So we have an improvement in the terms of trade. So what are we saying? We're saying basically, let's look at a simple example, that export prices are going up. And let's just say that import prices are going down to make life simple rather than saying not increasing as fast. So an improvement in the terms of trade will worsen the balance of payments. If we're worsening the balance of payments, let's look at, again, a simplistic model, exports going down and imports going up. Okay, so when will this happen? So if export prices go up, we know that people will want to buy less of our goods. If price elasticity of demand for exports is elastic, we could have prices going up prices going up a certain amount, but then the quantity demanded decreasing by proportionately even more. So in other words, if export prices go up, but we lose a lot of customers, well then export revenue would go down and the terms of trade would worsen. So I'm going to bet that we're looking at an elastic, price elastic demand. Let's look at it for imports. If the price elasticity of demand for imports is elastic, we have imports going up, import prices going down, my apologies, import prices going down, but we buy substantially more imports, thereby increasing our expenditure on imports. So yes, price elastic does make sense. And then the flip side, of course, it will improve if we're dealing with exports and imports being price inelastic. And again, you could go through the same logic. Developing countries have faced a deteriorating terms of trade for several reasons, and their current account has often been negatively affected. And this is in stark contrast to the situation facing developed countries. So if we look at developing countries exporting commodities, so we're dealing with cotton, maybe coffee, copper, and so on. If the price goes down and it's an inelastic demand, then the quantity demanded is not going to increase substantially more. It will increase proportionately less than the decrease in price. So their export revenue will decrease, and so their terms of trade will, not their terms of trade, their current account will worsen. If we look at developed countries producing things like smartphones and flat screen TVs and so on, as prices for these products drop, the price elasticity of demand for those exports tends to be elastic, so the price goes down and people want proportionately even more of these kind of goods. Their export revenue will increase and their current account will improve. So the two are definitely in stark contrast. So I've gone through this in the last slide. And the same thing with primary products, that the rest of the world will not want substantially more of their goods. I'll leave this slide for you to read. And this slide is in place if you were ever comparing and contrasting what's going to happen to either price and quantity as supply or demand changes, especially for developing countries. So let's do some testers. Let's say there's an increase in the demand for a country's exports. What will happen to its terms of trade and what will happen to the current account? Well, just a quick reminder, we're looking at quantity and price, and we're dealing with an increase in demand. And we have a revenue box here before, so total revenue before. And then we switch to an increase in demand. And total revenue after. We can see that the export revenue has increased. So what happens to the terms of trade? The terms of trade improve because the price of the goods have gone up. We know that export revenue has increased. And so we know the current account has improved. Under what conditions does a technological advance give rise to an improvement in a country's trade balance, even though its terms of trade deteriorate? Okay, so let's look at technological advance. So we know that supply increases, and so we know that price goes down, and so we know that terms of trade deteriorate if you're exporting those goods. So let's look at situation 1, where PED for exports is elastic. So we're looking at percentage change in quantity demanded of exports over percentage change in price. We know from up here that price has gone down. We know that according to law of demand, that quantity demanded will therefore increase. And if demand is elastic, then the numerator needs to be greater than the denominator. And so we have a decrease in price, but we gain proportionately more, that much in quantity demanded. So what happens to total revenue? So total revenue would increase, and so we would have, in this case, an improvement in the current account. Let's look at this as well in terms of if PED of exports is inelastic. This should be is. Again, percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in price. We still have price going down. We still have quantity demanded going up. But if the demand is inelastic, then the denominator must be greater than the numerator. So in other words, the change in price is proportionately greater than the change in quantity demanded. So here we can see that prices dropped perhaps substantially, but we only pick up relatively less in quantity demanded. So total revenue for exports would go down, and we'd have here the current account worsens. So it very clearly depends on the elasticity of demand, in this case for exports. Explain the consequences of inflation. It could be cost push, or it could be demand pull, on a country's terms of trade and its trade balance. And again, we've got to take elasticity into account. So if we have inflation, we have price went up, so terms of trade, if we're exporting these goods, terms of trade improve. Okay, so let's look at situation 1. Price elasticity of demand for exports is elastic. So percentage change in quantity demanded for exports over percentage change in price, and we said that the price increased. So if price increased, we know that quantity demanded will decrease, and if demand is elastic, then the numerator will be greater than the denominator, so the loss in quantity demanded is proportionately greater than the increase in price. So we know that total revenue from exports is down, and so we would have current account worsens. And 2, let's look at PED for exports being inelastic. Percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in price. We know from the situation of inflation that price went up. According to law of demand, quantity demanded goes down. And if demand is inelastic, then the change in price is proportionately greater than the change in quantity demanded. So we have price going up substantially, losing proportionately less in quantity demanded. So total revenue for exports goes up and the current account improves. In all the situations we've been doing up to this point, please do not memorize. Go through logically what is happening, what's happening to price, what's happening to terms of trade, what's going to happen to the balance of payments, but do not memorize. There is an exception to this. In this case, if we're using appreciation and depreciation of a currency, what is more likely to lead to an improvement, in a country's current account? In this case, do memorize. So memorize the Marshall-Lerner condition. You don't want to be recreating this with graphs and figuring out what's going on. So Marshall-Lerner condition. And so what's happening if a currency depreciates? And if, sorry about this, if the price elasticity of demand for exports plus the price elasticity of demand for imports, adding these together, if this is greater than 1, then the current account will improve. And the higher the number, or the greater the number, the greater the improvement. So if you memorize this one condition, you'll be able to figure out by using logic what would happen in the other situation. So we'll just run through a few examples. If a currency, instead of depreciating, if it appreciates and everything else holds true, meaning the price elasticity of demand for exports plus the price elasticity of demand for imports, if it's greater than 1, then we know the opposite is going to happen. The current account will worsen. Or if a country's currency depreciates and the PED for exports plus the PED for imports is less than 1, again, the opposite will happen. Current account will worsen. If you have two things that are moving in opposite directions, so you have a currency appreciating and you have the elasticity of demands for exports and imports being less than 1, then again, the current account will improve because the two are negating each other. So you memorize the one condition and you can logically figure out all of the rest. Okay, so in terms of the rest of this PowerPoint, I'm going to have you read this on your own. Please scroll through at your own speed with this PowerPoint. The rest is fairly straightforward and not having the mathematical components. So I will just show the slides for the rest of this in case you don't have the handout. And again, just pause and read the slides at your own pace.